Both Marta and Roberto for the kind words about the book which is coming out. I'm afraid it doesn't come with a money-back guarantee if it doesn't, in fact, make procurement law intelligible. I regret that that's not part of the conditions, but I did promise yesterday that I'd buy a pint for anyone who buys a copy, because I just about get the price of a pint for every copy that's sold. So that you can hold me to that. But anyways, moving on to the topic I've been invited to speak about today. I know, by the way, I was quite puzzled by the title of today's session, Fenceless Fences. So I'm very lucky that I actually was here for the first session this morning where it was explained to us, and I think there's someone from the Welsh Government here who can explain it to anybody who doesn't understand the title. I'll just give you a little hint, which is that it has something to do with sheep. That's all I'm going to say. But do find out, because it's quite an interesting project. Okay, I really enjoy, as the other speakers have already mentioned, Procurement Week is a fabulous opportunity to meet people from different walks of life, all interested for some inexplicable reason in this question of public procurement, which I also find myself drawn to. We hear a lot of ideas, and there's been a lot of discussion both yesterday and today about, what direction should we go in with public procurement? Should we try and use it to achieve different policy goals? Should we be less risk adverse in our public procurement? I like to be a little bit controversial and say sometimes actually there is a role for government to be risk adverse in its spending of public money. I think that is a legitimate aim of procurement. But as Caroline mentioned, maybe we need to look at it at the overall portfolio and say, here are areas where it really makes sense for us to be taking risks. So all of these interesting questions and debates, and the question that sort of started coming into my mind, and which I want to look at a bit more and hopefully get some of your views on as well, is can we actually, instead of basing procurement policy on experts, on our own experiences, on essentially anecdotal evidence, can we actually move to a more rigorous evidence base on procurement before we start changing directions and deciding to undertake major revolutions in procurement? So that's what I want to look at. The context, as I think everyone is probably aware, is that in Europe we very recently had a huge overhaul of our procurement legislation. This process took about 3 years. It was a wonderful time to be interested in procurement law, because there was just endless articles being written and debates being had, and you really felt like you were someone special if you knew a little bit of something about procurement law. So and happily, it's still going on, because obviously we have now the next year and a half, or just over a year now actually, for the 28 member states to implement in national law. As was mentioned yesterday, we have already the UK Public Contracts Regulations, which have very recently come into effect. And as was also drawn out by a few of our speakers yesterday, one of the major changes is that it really is quite obvious on the face of this legislation that there's a role for pursuing what are sometimes called horizontal objectives in procurement. Again, one of those wonderful terms we use in procurement, which sounds a bit more exciting than it is, but what it actually means is looking at policies other than just buying the thing that you want to buy at the best price you can get. So whether it's social value, whether it's environmental objectives, promotion of the SME, participation in public procurement, all of these things we put under the heading of horizontal objectives. There has been some research carried out in terms of, are people doing this on a large scale in Europe? And the answer is yes. The Commission actually funded a number of evaluation studies in 2011. And these found that actually over half of contracts awarded in the sample that was studied did include at least one criteria aimed at an environmental objective, or in some cases a social value objective. So this is something which is commonly taking place as part of regulated procurement procedures above the EU thresholds, and I think we can probably assume that it's taking place below the EU thresholds as well. However, we really don't have much idea of whether this is effective. And I'm someone who works quite a lot with contracting authorities who want to look at the green or social responsibility side of their procurement. And I have to be honest with them. I say we can try this, and I know other people who have tried it, and it'll be legal, and we can do it. But we really don't know whether it's going to work in the longer term to achieve your objective, whether that's reducing your carbon emissions or addressing local unemployment issues. We really don't have a strong evidence base on that to say whether or not it will work. What we do have coming on stream is very exciting new sources of data about procurement. And this is, I think, a trend that's really going to grow over the next few years. So we've got the move to fully electronic procurement over the next few years, meaning every procedure will, there'll have to be an electronic notice somewhere, and there'll also be e-tenders, electronic tenders coming back in. That opens up huge potential sources of data, so we can actually look at, well, what was done in that procedure, and then how many bids did you get, and what price did you end up paying in the end. That gives us one body of evidence. We're also in the UK, we have developments in terms of the UK Local Government Transparency Act, which has actually already pushed local authorities in particular to publishing even very low value contracts. Quite a lot of details are now available, and there are a number of startups actually that are looking at this data and have some interesting applications for that. So that's the sort of context that we're working within. What do I mean by evidence-based policy then? Why do I think it might be a useful direction to go in for procurement? Well, like Caroline, I was inspired by a book. Unfortunately, I don't have a copy of it with me here, but it's a book that some of you may have come across called Poor Economics. It came out in, I think, 2009 by two MIT economists, Abhijit Banerjee and Esther Duflo. Sorry, 2011 it was published. And essentially what they were doing was looking at the use of randomized controlled trials in development interventions. So a lot of money and a lot of goodwill goes into development interventions. It's not an area that I've worked in, but I think it's something that we're aware of, and I'm sure people like Caroline have more experience in that area. A lot of money goes in, and the results are mixed. Right? One of the examples they discuss is mosquito nets. So in malarial zones, you want to get people mosquito nets to protect them from mosquitoes. But how should you do that? Should you distribute mosquito nets for free? Or should you charge people a very small amount for a mosquito net? How do you make sure that they're actually going to use them for the intended purpose? And this is a major question because there's a lot of development organizations who are involved in these initiatives. And, ideology, what happens is that ideology gets into it. So one group of people says, well, you can't give people mosquito nets for free because they won't value them. They'll throw them away, or they'll use them as fishing nets or something because they don't value something that they get for free. And that's a position coming very much from ideology, right? And other people say, no, of course you should give them for free. And anyways, the point is we don't know until we actually study the outcome, right? So why not have 10 villages and randomly assign some of them to get free mosquito nets and some of them to have a very small fee and see what happens and have a control group. That's the basic concept. Some people raise, okay, well, there are potentially ethical issues there. Is it quite expensive to set up these studies? But in areas where they're used, and they're used obviously most commonly in medicine to test out new drugs, but they're also used increasingly in areas of social policy. And they tend to give us good evidence, and often that evidence is counterintuitive. Often it tells us, actually, you shouldn't bother making a policy intervention in this area because it's really not worth your while to do that. But the point is that it takes these type of policy initiatives out of the realm of witchcraft, out of the realm of, I think we should do this because it reflects my deeper beliefs about the economy or about society or about politics, right? So that's the basic concept. I think public procurement could be very well suited to this type of research. And the reason I think that is because we have thousands of contracts being awarded every day. A lot of them are roughly comparable. Even within a single organization, take something like the NHS, they award hundreds of contracts for more or less the same thing. Couldn't we take just some of those contracts and say, well, actually, we're going to try this. We're going to try this intervention for this contract. And we're going to, then look at the results and see how it works. That's the basic idea. An example of this in the UK context, which I think is somewhat timely, because most of you will be aware that at the same time that the public contracts regulations implement the EU directives, they also have introduced new measures for below threshold contracts. And these are based on the recommendations of Lord Young of Graffham, who was sent away to write a report on this problem, what was identified as a problem of small and medium-sized enterprises having insufficient access to UK government contracts. He went away, he spoke to SME associations, he drew on his own experience, etc. And what has come out of his report is a total ban on the use of pre-qualification questionnaires for below-threshold contracts. So you can't have any pre-qualification stage in a below-threshold contract, right? Which is a major, major change to the existing practices of contracting authorities. Now, people have different views on this. Some people think it's wonderful. Some people think it's a disaster. Obviously, it'll take some time to see the actual impact of this. But the point that I want to make is that this was not made, this decision, this major policy change was not made on robust evidence about what works in order to get SMEs into public contracts. Now, you'll note that even if you sort of accept that and say, okay, yeah, it should be based on something else, that doesn't actually take the politics out of it, because somebody still needs to say, actually, it's a problem that we don't have SMEs in public contracts, and this is a problem that we want to address. So there's still lots of room for expert opinions and political motivations. But if you could just take the middle stage of that and say, okay, instead of actually having have a consultation if you need to, but actually also study it. And see what the effect is of removing PQQs before you get the entire population of contracting authorities in the UK to change their practices. I think one of the reasons for doing this is that it's not a costless policy. We're talking about public authorities potentially getting a huge volume of tenders that they have to assess. Not for every procedure. Some procedures it'll be fine. But for some procedures, instead of inviting 5 to tender, you'll have 30 tenders that you need to assess. And that's a major implication for resources in evaluation. It's a major implication for resources in terms of the SMEs themselves preparing these bids. And this, I just love this picture. You can tell he's a businessman because he's got a bowler hat and an umbrella, and he's being held back by red tape physically, because red tape is bad. This came from the Telegraph last year when this policy was first mooted. Okay, so what would I suggest as a potential alternative approach to this problem if we think that SMEs not winning contracts is a problem? As I said, you randomly select a pool of contracts in which you could try different types of interventions. So one intervention might be removing a PQQ. One intervention might be conducting pre-market engagement, consultation, publishing a PIN, doing all these good practice things that we hear from colleagues in Wales and elsewhere. One intervention might be dividing it into small lots. One intervention might be allowing twice as long for people to submit tenders. And you can think of any number of these policies that are discussed, and there's a literature on them. But let's actually do it and then compare the results over time. Obviously, you need to have a control group. That's essential to this type of study. And then you do need to carry out validation work. So you can't just say, right, we have RCT evidence, that's it, now we know what to do. You do need to actually look at the mechanisms behind it and say, okay, well, here we seem to have a result here that actually where we did pre-market consultation, that actually was quite effective in getting SMEs to bid and in fact win public contracts. But why do we think that happened? What was the mechanism behind it? And that's when you really need to start talking both to those of us who sometimes get described as procurement experts and people who are actually awarding contracts themselves, more importantly. Okay, I think there are many other questions that would be amenable to this type of evidence, where it would be really interesting to do these type of studies. It's by no means an exclusively national government reserve, this idea of implementing policy through procurement. Roberto talked about this material substance doctrine of the European. It's credited to the European Commission rather than Thomas Aquinas, isn't it? Yeah. But so this idea that obviously the EU sees the single market as being it's a policy. The single market is a policy, right? And it's been implemented over a long period of time. And then on top of that, you have a lot of if you look at the procurement directives, behind it is this idea of, well, competition is good. And you should remove barriers to competition. Okay, that's good, but it's a theory, right? It's a hypothesis. And there's various evidence to support it. But do we actually know that in public procurement, having more competition leads to lower prices being paid, for example, over time? Is that true? Or when you take into account transaction costs? Maybe it does in the longer term, but not in the shorter term. We don't know the answer to that. And then there's all kinds of other theories that really inform our procurement law and policy, and I've listed a few of them there. So yeah. But I'd be very interested to hear about anyone who's done experiments like this or who thinks there might be a role for them in their own policy. And that's it.